Hey everyone, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we are going to be talking about American Nightmares on DVD. So, American Nightmares is a horror anthology that came out in 2018, and it was written and directed by Darin and Rusty Cundieff, the same two gentlemen who were behind the horror movie classic from the 90s, Tales from the Hood, and definitely a good horror anthology, as well as its sequel, Tales from the Hood Part 2, which came out several years later. And so I've always been a fan of horror anthologies because of the amount of variety that comes with telling a multitude of stories in one movie. If you want to go old school, you got movies like Tales from the Crypt, Creep Show, Heavy Metal, and also if we're going, say a little more modern, movies like Trick or Treat, as well as the VHS film series. And so I like anthologies in general. It doesn't have to be exclusively horror. But in terms of horror anthologies, though, American Nightmares, unfortunately, was a bit of a disappointment because there's just enough good in the sense that it's not a complete waste of time, but unfortunately the negatives outweigh the positives. But by the way, your eyes do not deceive you. This is Danny Trejo on the cover, sort of turning into a Grim Reaper-esque figure. While this does not happen in the movie, he is the gentleman who is narrating the stories. And so I was definitely intrigued by this because, I like horror anthologies, and I'm kind of fond of Danny Trejo too. So the idea of him narrating a horror anthology movie, I was like, I want to check this out. And so, plus this was on clearance, so there you go. Anyway, the movie kicks off with these two college-age hackers who are screwing around, watching porn, hacking into people's feeds, and in some cases, ruining people's lives, by way of, leaking a lot of their personal and private info out for the world to see. And so these are really not nice guys, but one day they're, doing their usual thing when they themselves get hacked. And their computer monitor screens, next thing they know, are showing them a room wherein two people are sitting across from each other. A man named Mr Malevolent, as played by Danny Trejo, and a woman, a sort of witch woman, played by Nichelle Nichols. Yes, her from Star Trek. The two of them are sitting across from each other, and Mr. Malevolent is politely asking her, if she's got any stories for him to tell. And so she'll use these sort of magic words and, weave her hands around on the table in between them. And once she's done her magic, this object will appear. And Mr. Malevolent will pick up the object, and from there, he'll start to tell a story which in some way ties into, say, the twisted morality of society in the world today, specifically in, say, Trump's America, because this was made when Donald Trump was still president, before COVID, though. And so I will say that, the stories definitely have a variety to them, and it was interesting seeing, I guess you could say, a more liberal side of things, because, as you get older, even if you're, say, more liberal or conservative, you can at least appreciate, a more, I guess you could say, political, focus, if it's done well. And unfortunately, I think American Nightmares is one of those things where it had some good messages, but it also suffered from very rushed pacing as well as a low budget. And I think that the low budget might not have been such a hindrance if, say, for instance, they had focused on certain stories within this movie and, say, tossed a few of the other stories out. And because that would have given the movie makers or the people involved in making the movie more time to flesh out the stronger stories. And those would have been the focus of the movie. And the stories that were sort of, ho-hum would have just been, tossed to the side. But because you have so many stories in one movie, and each story is at a rushed pace. While some of the stories have a good message, and at least one or two of the segments I actually thought were good, for the most part, there's not a lot of time to really connect with the material simply because of how rushed everything is. And so, the first story is called Mates, and it deals with online dating as well as abusive ex-partners. And so I did appreciate the fact that in some way they brought in an element of science fiction, in the sense that this online dating site actually, semi-spoiler, specialized in artificial people, and androids. And the androids were the ones who were the quote-unquote perfect mates for the people who were trying the website out. And so I liked that aspect of it, in a sense that they actually brought some form of science fiction into it. And the actors were good. The woman who was trying to move on from an abusive relationship and trying out the website, I liked her character. I mean, she was a good actor. The actress who played her did a good job. The guy who played the android, or except she doesn't know he's an android until things get kind of freaky when her abusive ex come into the picture. So it's like one night everything kind of comes out to the into the light, so to speak. The guy who played her new man, the quote-unquote perfect man, was a good actor. And the guy who played the abusive ex, I mean, he was pretty good, but I think that, because of how rushed the story was, they really missed out on the chance to tap into some of the more existential themes that they could have played with, like, say, for instance, the idea of maybe the android sort of going on beyond his programming and having, say, a sort of psychological conflict when the abusive ex comes back into the picture. Because there's really no big twist. I mean, you could tell that there's something that's going to happen with this perfect man. Like, you're like, there's something of a supernatural nature that's going to come into play. So, but I mean, the only quote-unquote twist is that he's a robot. But even then, though, they don't really do anything, say, from a psychological or emotional standpoint with his character. It's, the main focus is, the woman and her conflict with her abusive ex. And so I just think that, I mean, while I guess you could say maybe that was like a little more close to home for a lot of people, or maybe more relatable for a lot of people, I just think that, this being a horror movie and the fact that they brought an android into things, they could have done more, with, I guess you could say, a science fiction side of things with the story. But it was kind of a missed opportunity. But I mean, not a bad segment, because, I mean, the actors did a good job. It's just that because of how rushed it was and some of the missed opportunities that they had, the second segment was just sort of eh. But the next segment was called The Prosecutor, and it had Jay Moore from Small Soldiers and Suicide Kings as a prosecutor with political ambitions who is not above knowingly sending an innocent man to death row in order to further his political career. And unfortunately for him and his family, on the night that, prior to him, being elected governor of Texas, this one particular individual that he had knowingly sent to death row, even though the guy was innocent, on the eve that the guy is going to be executed, said guy ends up escaping. And next thing, this prosecutor knows, or former prosecutor knows, and soon-to-be governor knows, the guy's in his house. The power's out, and he's being stalked. And things don't turn out well for his family, but not for the reasons you would think. And so, once again, this was a segment that I felt like the actors actually did a good job, but unfortunately, because of how rushed it was, while there was a strong message in the story about how a lot of people of different ethnicities have been basically screwed over by the judicial system, as well as by politicians who are trying to further their own political careers. I felt like because of how rushed it was, there really wasn't a whole lot of opportunity to say connect with the characters. I mean, Jay Moore, does a good job of playing the sleazy politician, but I felt like the other actors, while they weren't bad, like they were all good with what they had to work with. I felt like if we'd gotten to know some of them more, like the man who was sent to death row, even though he was innocent, like if we'd gotten to know him more as a character, I feel like there would have been a stronger hook to the story, to go along with the relevant message. Although I will say that the dark twist to the story, while you can see it coming from a mile away, partially because of how rushed the story is, again, I do appreciate that they actually went the route that they did, because it was a harsh twist, and the fact that they went for it kind of gives, the story some form of, weight, I guess you could say. So I'm not going to say it was a good segment, but at the same time, I think it was an improvement over the first segment, in a sense that there actually was a twist to the story, and there was a coherent message, if you will. Unfortunately, the third segment, called White Flight, this is a segment I feel like should have been excised altogether. Like maybe they could have had it as a bonus feature on the DVD or something, but as far as being in the actual movie, they should have gotten rid of it altogether, because it's one of those things where okay, so the whole setup is this racist former police officer, and also stereotypical redneck, is working on building a machine to send him to another time or another dimension. It was kind of tricky as far as figuring out which one it was, but basically he's wanting to build a machine that will send him and his family to some place that is similar to, say, how America used to be in the 1950s, wherein white people were in full dominance of things, and all the other races were, all other ethnicities were more or less subservient. And so basically, even though this guy is a dim-witted redneck with no scientific qualifications, as far as the audience can tell, somehow he and his family, they get the parts they need, they build this machine, and they go to this other place, and it's this sort of postcard perfect white dominated town that looks like it's from the 1950s, with no blacks allowed ever. But unfortunately for them, the color black doesn't necessarily apply to skin. It applies to one's hair. And so while the racist protagonist is kind of in the clear because he's a blonde-haired white guy, his family's not, because they all have dark hair. And so things do not go well for the family. So here's the thing. I feel like, if they had tooled around with it a bit, if maybe they'd had a little bit more of runtime, I think that, the segment might have been stronger in terms of, say, the harsh twist that comes into play. Because, to be fair, it is a harsh twist. And I guess you could say, in better hands, it would have been darkly comical as well. But unfortunately, because of how fast everything's going, you can kind of see a twist coming from a mile away. But unlike the last story, wherein this harsh twist kind of gave that story some teeth, this harsh twist, it just felt like it was happening to filler characters, or at least characters that I felt like I was kind of hoping something would happen to them. I didn't really feel any sort of sympathy for them or anything like that, because the the main guy, I mean, he's so cartoonishly racist that, I mean, it was hard to take him seriously. I mean, yes, I know that there are people who give stereotypes, a reason for existing. But unfortunately, though, I felt like that, the message might have been stronger if, say, the guy had not been so cartoonish in his evil. Like if he'd been a little more, I guess you could say, flesh and blood, realistic, I guess. I mean, I think that in that way, the story, the twist that comes with the story might have carried more weight. But as it is, all that happens is, it's something nasty that happens to people we don't care about. And in fact, we're kind of wanting them to be taken out of the picture simply because of how cartoonishly, racist they are. And so, yeah, I felt like this was probably, a segment that had, little to no redeeming value, at least in my opinion, simply because of how cartoonish it was, and over the top. Whereas the other two segments, at the very least, I mean, even though that first segment, I felt like, it didn't have much in the way of a twist, at least the acting was good. Where in the second segment, while unfortunately it was quite rushed, it at least actually had something of a good message, and the acting was good. So whereas this segment, White Flight, nah. So like I said, they should have been, left as like a bonus feature on the DVD or something. But the fourth segment is called The Samaritan, and this, in my opinion, was probably the first good segment in the movie, or in our horror anthology here. And basically, it centers on this prostitute who is being, driven by her pimp to go entertain a supposedly terminally ill client. And this guy, apparently, I mean, he's on his last legs, and he's always wanted to explore a certain circus fetish that he's had. And so he's asking her, once she and the pimp, get to his apartment, he asks her to, dress up as a clown for him. And so, okay, everyone's got their kinks, right? So while she's going to be entertaining him, the pimp goes out of his way to try and find stuff to steal from the guy's apartment. But this guy is not as terminally ill as he, led them to believe. In fact, he's a horrific serial killer who, in fact, does have a clown fetish, both, for dressing his victims up as clowns and for dressing himself up as a clown as well, and killing his victims while dressed up as a clown. So, the prostitute, she actually makes contact with a ghost of one of the guy's former victims by way of a crucifix she's wearing. Somehow or another, the ghost of one of his former victims is able to, reach out and grab a hold of the crucifix, probably from like the other side or something. And so as long as she has a hold of the crucifix, she's able to tell the prostitute what's going on, and she's trying to give her a chance to get out of the situation alive. And so I actually like this segment because in terms of straight up horror, it was pretty effective. And also in terms of like the tone and, the cinematography, I felt like this was probably, the first segment within this anthology that had some, serious weight to it, I guess you could say. Whereas the other segments seemed to be more satirical, like this one actually had some depth to it, I felt like. It was straight up serious. And so, like I remember there was this, one nice visual moment where, as the prostitute is being driven, by her pimp in the car, it's at night, they're driving on a city street, and, she's looking out, her, window in the car, and it shows her hand on her crucifix, and the camera kind of zooms in on the crucifix, and then it sort of dissolves into this, busy, four-way cross street at night. And that was actually a very nice shot. And, compared to, say, the, visual stuff that had come, prior to this segment, this was definitely a step up in terms of, I guess you could say, crafting a, I guess you could say, more memorable world on screen than the other segments had done. And also, while it wasn't, say, the focus of the movie, I do appreciate that they sort of touched on the aspect of human trafficking, because based on the dynamic between her and the pimp, you get the idea that the prostitute was, while she's going along with this out of necessity, it's not something she wants to do. And you get the idea, just based on her demeanor and how she interacts with the pimp, that she was forced into this life. And so, and also, just the fact that the pimp, is a criminal himself, is one of those instances where, other than the prostitute and the ghost of the murdered girl, no one's innocent in the story. And the actor who plays the serial killer slash client, he was actually really good too, because there are moments where he's like darkly comical, but then he becomes straight up scary. And the whole idea of him dressed up as a clown, trying to go after the prostitute who's also dressed up as a clown, it would be funny on paper, but it ends up being straight up horrifying. And so I actually really enjoyed this segment, simply because it was a work of straight up horror that did its job well. And once things go down to where she's being hunted in the apartment by the serial killer, there were definitely moments where I wasn't on the edge of my seat, but because of how in your face and freaky the horror was, there were moments where like, whoa, that kind of thing. So I wasn't on the edge of my seat, but I was kind of thrown back in my seat a little bit. So the Samaritan was definitely a good segment in this horror anthology. The next story, Hate Radio, it's something that I felt like is somewhere between bad and good. All around, I guess you could say it's meh, but it's one of those things where it has a good it does have a valid message to it, but unfortunately, because of how I guess you could say rushed everything is, and how over the top everything is, it just I felt like while it did have a good message, it was something that I think didn't really do much in the way of emotionally connecting, if that makes sense. But basically, the main character of the story is a far-right, misogynistic radio show host. And so basically he's, on a nightly basis, screaming out his views over the airwaves, basically every far-right cliche you could think of, throw in a, up to 11 level of misogyny, and you got the idea. But one particular night, this guy somehow finds himself being forcibly transformed into a woman. And so he goes outside of his house, trying to, flag down, someone to help him. Why he doesn't just call 911, I don't know. But anyway, he ends up passing out, and he's rescued by a passing motorist. Unfortunately for our misogynistic radio show host, though, this passing motorist happens to be a misogynistic serial killer. And this serial killer also happens to be this radio show host's #1 fan. But he doesn't take it too well when our radio show host, who is now a woman, is trying to tell this serial killer that he is not a woman. He's, your favorite radio show host. And so, yeah, things don't go well. This was a segment, like I said, I just think that it's kind of meh. On one hand, I do appreciate, the message that they had about how, people who are as misogynistic as this guy is are, unfortunately in positions of power in our society, and something needs to be done about it. Yes, that's a good message. I agree with that. And also, I mean, you have a lot of people, on the far right who have a lot of, rabid Mad Dog views, and unfortunately, a lot of people who are in, I guess you could say, an emotionally damaged or psychologically damaged state of mind are very susceptible to some of these views of hatred. But, just real quick, I just want to say that this does not exclusively apply to the right. Both sides have their share of lunatics, the far right and the far left. So I just wanted to say that real quick. But the focus of the story is, going after the far right. But unfortunately, like all the other stories, the main problem that plagues the story is the fact that it's rushed. And because of that, while the message is relevant, we don't really get much time to say, I guess, connect with, the characters in the story. Like they could have had something to where, I'm not saying, make the hate-filled radio host likable or anything like that, but maybe if they'd had something, exploring his background a little bit, like, why is he the way he is, I think maybe we could have understood, why he's so hate-filled, that kind of thing, to where at least, okay, there's at least some reasoning behind it. But as it is, much like the villain protagonist in White Flight, the guy in Hate Radio just comes across as, so over the top, cartoonishly evil and misogynistic that, it's just, like it's kind of funny, but at the same time it's not funny, if that makes sense, simply because of how over the top it is. Because and unfortunately, because of that, the valid message that the story has, I feel like just kind of gets, I'm not going to say it gets lost, because the message is there, but it gets kind of pushed to the side in terms of how over the top everything is. And plus, the special effects that come into play when the guy is being somehow turned into a woman, you could definitely tell that, this is where the film's low budget makes itself known, because the special effects, while they are grotesque, they're very, you could tell that it's not top-notch quality. And I do wish that they'd had some form of explanation as to how this guy was forcibly turned into a woman, because I mean it's magical in nature in some way, but you don't know how or why or who did this to him. And also, I was kind of, hoping that there'd be some form of exploration as to, say, why the serial killer is the way he is. The one that's, the number one fan of this radio show host, but who is also a misogynist as well, and who likes to kill women. And he's actually played by James Duvall, sort of a veteran of independent films, and he also was Frank the Bunny Rabbit in Donnie Darko. And so it was cool to see him, but unfortunately he's only in the movie for in the segment for a few minutes. And so, like I said, everything's just too rushed to really build a connection with anyone. Like, I just feel like if there had been some form of exploration into, say, the radio show host's backstory as well as the serial killer's backstory, I think that we might have been able to connect better with the message that the story had. But because of how rushed everything is, as well as, the low budget nature of the special effects, I think the story is just kind of, I mean, not terrible, but, at the same time, it's kind of forgettable too. So the next segment, the next to last segment, is called The Healer. And I would say that alongside The Samaritan, this is the other good story in American Nightmares. Basically you have this black preacher who has this this huge network of power within the church community. Basically he's got bukus of money, all these people who are followers of him, and he also, claims to be able to heal people, to a point of, say, he'll give people the quote-unquote water of Jesus, which is actually just, bottles of water with his name on them, but with just regular bottles of water. But basically, he's a con artist who has, amongst other things, gotten, a boatload of people to, give money to him, in the hopes that, the waters or tears of Jesus, basically just tap water, will heal them. And basically, I mean, the guy is living the high life at the cost of his parishioners and, screwing them over. But one day, he makes the acquaintance of a father of one of his parishioners who unfortunately died because she was suffering from terminal cancer, and she basically gave all her money to him, for the tears or the waters of Jesus in order to be healed. But unfortunately, because it was just tap water, nothing happened. And so this vengeful father, played by Clarence Williams III, fantastic actor, he tracks this pastor down and takes him hostage and gives him a form of supernatural comeuppance, to where this guy, this pastor, he actually does end up having the power to heal people, but at a very gruesome price on his own body. And so I think this is a segment that, while yes, it too is very rushed, in terms of straight up acting, I think, this was the most powerful of the segments, because, as I mentioned, I mean, you had Clarence Williams III playing the vengeful, grieving father, and he does it so well that you could just feel the human, tragedy of the situation. I mean, he was a father who had to watch his daughter die because, I mean, instead of, going, to the hospital, or trying to get medical help, she believed wholly in this pastor's ability to heal, even though it was a scam the whole time, and he had to watch her die because of it. And so you really connect with Clarence Williams the third's character in that regard. And it's like, no one should have to outlive their children, and so and also the actor who plays the healer, the pastor, Barry Shabaka Henley, very good actor. If the name sounds familiar, you probably saw him in the movie Collateral with Tom Cruise and Jamie Foxx. He was the jazz guy. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. Great movie, check it out. And even though he has a small part in it, it's a very memorable part in a very memorable movie. But no, so he does a very good job playing the corrupt pastor. And I mean, he does play a lot of he plays up some of the con artist pastor stereotypes. Like, say, think of a black version of Benny Hinn, and you get the gist of it. But he does such a good job of making this guy so despicable. And it's one of those things where it does a good job of balancing it between, say, dark humor and straight up, I guess you could say, injustice of the situation, because of how much he's profited from other people's misery. And this is one of those segments that I think that actually does a good job of balancing a line between the serious horror as well as the over-the-top comedy, because I mean, when it's focusing on the pastor, I think his name was Reverend Love. I mean, there's a lot of dark comedy in terms of just how over the top he is and how he abuses his parishioners. But then when Clarence Williams III's character comes into play, that's when the more human element comes in. That's when the serious horror, comes out to play, so to speak. And so, what ends up happening to the corrupt reverend, by way of, the vengeful father, and the supernatural means he resorts to, um, it's classic Tales from the Crypt stuff. I mean, it's Tales from my tongue tied. It's classic Tales from the Crypt stuff in terms of uh, karmic vengeance on a supernatural level, and it's something that's so poetic that it's like even in the segment's brief runtime, it's like they got it right with this one. So, in my opinion, the healer should have been the last segment in this movie, because as far as the anthology segments go, because unfortunately, while the healer is the next to last segment, the last segment unfortunately kind of joins White Flights in terms of being something that they should have just left on the either cutting room floor or saved as just a bonus feature on the DVD, because the segment is called They Will Be Done, and it deals with the subject of abortion versus right to life, which, to be sure, is a very serious debate and subject right now. But unfortunately, because of how ham-handed and over-the-top the segment is, it's very difficult to take seriously. But basically, this one young woman, she makes an appointment to have an abortion, but she's kidnapped by three rabid right-to-lifers who hold her hostage and are basically going to save her by, spiritually, or like by forcing her to have her baby. And she's trying to tell them, you don't understand, I was raped. And they're saying, well, that's no excuse to kill the baby, it's not the baby's fault that you were raped. And so you're thinking initially, well, okay, that something supernatural is going to happen, this being the kind of movie it is, but at the same time, it's one of those things where it's like, the message was good, or at least, I'm not going to say it was good, but at the very least, the message was there. Like, there are instances where I think, well, it's one of those things where, I mean, I'm a guy, so I take my opinion with a grain of salt, but, it's one of those instances where, abortion is something that, I don't think should just be, it's not a conclusion that I think people should come to very easily. I think they should, discuss all the, options and everything. But at the same time, as harsh as it sounds, I feel that it's something that should be an option, because there are circumstances where, I mean, it's good. Having the baby would adversely affect the woman, and oftentimes, it's due to circumstances outside of her control. And so it's one of those things where it's like, I appreciate what they were trying to do, but because of how over the top the acting was, it just robbed the segment of any emotional power that it would have had otherwise. But also, unfortunately, this is where the low budget rears its ugly head, because this is supposed to be a pregnant woman, but there are shots where you can tell that it's the pregnant belly is just like a pillow or something. And also there are instances where she's running around trying to get away from these right to lifers, where it's like even with some form of desperation, a pregnant woman wouldn't be as athletic as she was. And also the acting by the right to lifers, it's so cartoonish and over the top that it's like, I mean, they could have used this segment to really kind of, touch on both sides of the argument, to the point where, okay, yes, it's a segment in a horror anthology, but maybe in some way they could have, brought up, arguments for both sides, to where it's like, okay, there's a point to be made for both sides here, but this is a situation where, yes, aborting the baby is best for everyone, because unfortunately, this being the type of movie it is, the person she was raped by was someone of a, shall we say, demonic nature. So yeah, the birth of this particular baby will not bode well for the world as well as, everyone involved in the story. But just because of how rushed everything was and how over the top, comical, or farcical is a better word, the acting is, it just feels like, they had a missed opportunity here. And unfortunately, this is the last segment of the movie. And so, whereas the healer was by far the strongest segment, at least in my opinion, and would have been a good final segment for the movie, They Will Be Done, unfortunately, ends the movie on, a sort of laughable note. Even though a serious, message is attempting to be made in that segment. But, yeah, so overall, like I said at the beginning of the review, the negatives outweigh the positives, but at the very least, I can say that as disappointing as the overall movie was, there were two legitimately good stories within this movie. Also, I just wanted to touch on the wraparound segment, the one with Danny Trejo as Mr. Malevolent and Nichelle Nichols as, the witch woman. That was a segment where it's very strange because on one hand, it's like you're definitely wanting those two, college-age hackers to get what's coming to them because, as the movie goes on, certain revelations come to light, like, someone that, one of the hackers, put on blast ended up committing suicide because of the stuff that was, basically revealed to everyone and their mother that was supposed to be private, that kind of thing. And so you definitely want these two guys to get their comeuppance, but at the same time, though, it's like, with, a lot of the other villains in this anthology, there's not a lot of time to, give some form of depth to the characters to the point where, maybe there'd be some form of tension as the stories goes on. As the stories go on. Because I think that's what they were trying to do. Like as the stories went on, the guys seemed to realize that they had no control over the situation. But because they're so despicable, though, you don't really feel any sense of urgency, at least in relation to their characters. But also, when it comes to Mr. Malevolent and the Witch Woman, it was one of those strange moments where I could tell that Danny Trejo and Nichelle Nichols were having fun, with what they were doing. Like, they were having a good time. So that was nice to see. And also, I never thought I'd see the day where, Machete would be, talking shop with Uhura from Star Trek, And so that was fun to see. But unfortunately, there's really not much in the way of character development in regards to their particular characters. And I feel like that, if they'd had, say, more in the way of interpersonal dialogue with one another, I feel like, their characters would have come off as more memorable and maybe more, I guess you could say, spooky, like they were trying to go for. Because, I mean, you could, even though, the low budget is, rearing its ugly head again in terms of like their wardrobes and what have you, I feel like that if they had more time to interact with each other within the movie, I think that, these two, people who are pulling the strings here, would have come across as maybe more ominous as far as, presence goes, But yeah, it's one of those, the weird things where it was fun to see the two of them having fun. I just wish that there'd been more time given to their characters to where maybe we could have seen more of their interactions with one another. Like we could have gotten to know them as characters. But unfortunately, Nichelle Nichols passed away not that long ago, and so there's in terms of being able to see her on screen again in a movie like this, that's not going to happen, unfortunately. So, rest in peace, Nichelle Nichols. I mean, she was a good actress and, by all accounts, a very nice woman, especially with her fans and what have you. So, Danny Trejo, on the other hand, is still alive, and so he's kind of made a resurgence in his career in terms of having a B movie renaissance as of late, and so it would be cool to see him in another movie like this. Like another horror anthology with this, socially, conscious, angle to things. But I just think that, maybe if they had, reduced the amount of stories that were in this, would-be horror anthology, in this hypothetical scenario, or maybe if they'd, given more time to the characters for some depth and substance. I really think that the character of Mr. Malevolent, as played by Danny Trejo, it'd be cool to see him in another horror anthology, just because you could tell Danny Trejo is having fun with it. But just maybe if they learn from their mistakes with this movie, going forward, hopefully if they do make another American Nightmares movie, the next one will be better, hopefully, if they make one. But I'm going to go ahead and give American Nightmares 2 out of 5 stars. It was okay, but I will say that the 2 good segments that were in this movie, did make it worth watching, at least in my opinion. So, I mean, worth a rental at the very least. But at the same time, if you don't see it, you're not going to miss much. And also, as far as special features go, unfortunately, there's really not much. There's just a bunch of trailers for various movies, and I think that, not that this movie is like a good movie or anything like that, but considering that Darin Scott and Rusty Cundieff were involved, that they wrote and directed this movie. Darin Scott directed some of the segments, and Rusty Cundieff directed the other segments. I don't remember which one directed which, but. And considering that these guys, though, were, as mentioned earlier, they were the ones behind, the, classic, 90s horror anthology, Tales from the Hood, it would have been cool if there'd been maybe a little bit of maybe like a documentary or, making a featurette on this movie, because, seeing these guys come back into the anthology scene, it's, kind of a treat, and it would have been interesting seeing what they had to say about their intentions with this movie and what have you. But as it is, it's just a bunch of trailers as far as special features go. But yeah, so if you're a horror anthology buff, it's worth a rental at least. But beyond that, really not much in the way of recommendation, aside from the 2 good stories and seeing Danny Trejo in the role of a horror narrator. But thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. Y'all got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. Got any feedback? I'd love to hear it. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. So thank you very much for dropping in. Y'all have a good night. Bye.